Daniel Naroditsky has an 82% win rate in this variation of the Jobava London. It's a very common position in the beginner and intermediate range. I'll run you through some of the basics, and then we'll take a look at one of Danya's games where he crushes a GM in just 25 moves. So we'll start with our normal Jobava London setup. So it's d4, d5, knight c3, knight f6, and then bishop f4. Now, this variation happens when our opponent plays the immediate c5, which is super common. So what we do is we push e3, defending our pawn. If they ever capture, we capture back and it's fine. And then if they play e6, we have the line that you saw in the thumbnail. So the best move in this position is jumping forward with our knight, aiming for the c7 square, which would fork the rook and the king. A lot of beginners will just miss this, and it's why the Jobava is so dangerous at that level. But the move that's forced here is knight a6. So there's a lot of problems with this knight on a6, and it's a big reason why this position is so tough to play for black. So first off, our knight is just amazing. It's constantly pressuring that fork. We have pressure on that pawn as well. It's far into black's territory. So our knight is great, whereas their knight is on the rim, doesn't have much prospects to get back into the game. It can't even go to this square to contest the knight because we would just take it. And that knight is just awkwardly placed. Even worse, it's blocking the advancement of the a-pawn. So this a-pawn can't move forward to get our knight out. So it means our knight is essentially permanently staying here unless black decides to trade his light squared bishop away. Obviously, we're totally fine if they give their bishop away because we would have the bishop pair and a great position from there. So like I was mentioning, this knight is an absolute beast. It's putting in a ton of positional pressure on black's position, but there's nothing you can force just yet. So when you find yourself in this position, it's just a good idea to follow the general Jobava plans. So generally, you want to bring your knight from f3 all the way to e5. You can bring your queen out to start an early attack. The bishop often belongs on d3, but in this variation, e2 is totally fine. You want to be a little careful of the c4 push coming with tempo. This knight can also get a little vulnerable when that happens, so you can also consider a4 to solidify it. And like I was saying, this is just a really easy position to play for white, whereas black has all these awkward problems to deal with, these awkward squares, and it's a pretty easy game from there. So let's jump into this Danya game now. We'll see how he crushes the GM in just 25 moves, and let's keep all these general principles in mind and see exactly how he executes them to win. So we have Daniel here up against the Canadian GM Spirit of Wonder. Before we start, if you're enjoying the video, I'd really appreciate a like and subscribe. I'm trying to get to 1,000 subscribers, and it would mean a lot. So this match starts out d4, knight f6, knight c3, d5, and then we get our Jobava setup with bishop f4. So the opponent here plays e6, and there's two moves. You can either play it slowly with the immediate e3, or what I like to do personally is you jump your knight forward, and you're immediately going after that square, and that's a really fun line that you can look into later as well. So Daniel decides to go for the more patient, more flexible approach, just playing e6 here. And that's where our opponent strikes with c5. And now Daniel will jump forward with the knight. And just like we talked about before, it's just so difficult to remove this knight. So knight a6 is forced from our opponent. And then Daniel's just going to develop normally for a while. We have c3, solidifying our center. Bishop e7. Again, a great thing about this knight is it controls that square. So black can't get the more active position there, and then Daniel just develops normally. We have f3, castles, bishop d3, bishop d7, getting ready to possibly take out this knight. So like I was mentioning earlier, Danya really wouldn't be worried about losing this knight for the bishop. He'd get the bishop pair, and that would be a solid position moving further into the game. But there is a tactic you have to be careful of. If we were just to castle and pass the move on to black, there's this c4 move, which would hit our bishop, and more importantly, block the connection with the knight. So Danya has to respond to that, and that's why you see a4 here. Then we have c4, doing this plan anyway, closing up the center, but I don't think this is super good for black, to be honest. Even though the engine gives black a slight edge, you're going to see that these kingside attacks in the Jobava come very quickly, especially when this pawn is locked down. Or you can even play it flexibly and just break on this side of the board. So I'm never too worried about seeing that early c4 push. So getting back to the game, black jumps forward with his knight, putting pressure on our c3 pawn here. And that makes that break we were talking about earlier not possible because it would just hang this pawn here. But that's fine for now. Danya as well jumps his knight forward. And now we're pressuring this light squared bishop. If this light squared bishop comes off the board, then this outpost for this knight would be absolutely amazing. So we have f5 from our opponent, solidifying this knight, and Danya decides to trade it off. That was certainly black's best piece by a mile, so Danya decides it's worth giving up the bishop pair for it. Black recaptures, opening up the f-file, which might be important later, and then Danya decides to take the bishop as well, taking away that bishop pair advantage that black had, and like we were talking about, just getting this knight completely uncontested on this b5 square. So Danya's next move is to bring the queen out. The queen is super active on this g4 square. Oftentimes when you recapture with your f-pawn, this becomes a massive weakness, and you can already see the pressure that's going to start to build up on it. Black's next move is to improve the position of his bishop, moving it to f6, and Daniel decides to castle. So you can see that white has a reasonable advantage. It's about 0.8 from the engine, and you can see why. I think it's mostly because this knight is just so much better than its counterpart, and we also have some really meaningful pressure against this weakness here on e6. But you'll see black's next move, rook f to c8, is just a step in the wrong direction, and already the evaluation is just skyrocketing. And I think the main reason is because this rook just isn't doing much. It's just looking at a completely closed file. I think what maybe black was thinking was he really needs to get this knight back into the game, but obviously the rook defending that square doesn't really help because he would have to give up the exchange if he wanted to trade pieces there. So I'm not really sure what he was thinking, and Danya makes him pay pretty much instantly. So he opens up the position with f3, looking to control this f-file and exert his pressure that way. So we have black taking, Danya recaptures with the rook, preparing to double. Black comes back with the rook again, kind of realizing, whoops, I've messed up. But there was just not enough time to be wasting a move like that. So you can see how tough black's position is looking right now. This knight is still useless. This knight is still amazing. We have both our rooks here controlling this f-file, and it's really tough for black. Black decides to move his king over to the h-file, making his position even worse. I guess he was just thinking he didn't have any great moves and he wanted to get out of this x-ray. But now, Danya moves his bishop to e5, and this bishop is pinned. He can't do anything. Black moves the queen back, defending both the bishop and the rook if the bishop were to move. But then this opens up this skewer here. And this is what I was talking about. This knight, it didn't do anything the entire game, just kind of sat there, and eventually it opened up this tactic for Danya to win the exchange. So I'll run you through the last moves pretty quickly in this game. Black moves his queen, Danya collects the exchange, and you can see it's already so tough for black. This knight is still useless. This queen is set up with an x-ray with the rooks, and Danya prepares to threaten that by pushing e4, eventually e5, which would collect this bishop. So black takes, white recaptures with the knight, and black eventually tries to get his knight back into the game, but Danya forks the queen and the pawn. The queen moves, Danya gets the pawn, and black just decides he's had enough. It's hard to blame him. He's down the exchange. He's now losing pawns, and you can see just how effortless Danya made this victory look. And going back to the start of the game, you can really see that it is this knight that is the real hero. It's once you push c5, you're forced to block with this knight. This knight is just invincible. It just sits there the whole game. And like I was saying, that's truly the big reason about why Daniel's win rate is so high in this variation. So that wraps up this video. Thanks a lot for watching till the end. Let me know in the comments if you're enjoying learning about the Jobava. I know I have a ton of fun playing it in ranked. Other than that, please remember to like and subscribe. It helps a lot. And if you enjoyed this video, I made another video on the Jobava covering more of the basics, and you might really like that. It should be somewhere on the screen.